Chapter 4: Value, Class, and the Theory of Society. Marxism and the Critique of Political Economy. Despite Marx's proclamation of the death of philosophy in his early works, his critique of political economy in those works remained essentially an extrinsic philosophical critique, in the sense that his critique of political economy at this time ultimately rested on an appeal to abstract categories of so-called human nature, society, and history. In Capital, by contrast, Marx abandoned such abstract categories, developing an analysis of capitalism as a form of social production, which developed historically through the interaction of, quote, individuals, not as they may appear in their own or other people's imagination, but as individuals really are, i.e., as individuals operate, produce materially, and hence as individuals work, under definite material limits, presuppositions, and conditions independent of their will. End quote. German Ideology. It is very easy to see this difference between Marx's early and mature works as marking a distinction between an early humanistic philosophy, based on the theory of an alienated human nature, and a later scientific economics, which formulates objective economic laws, which formulates objective economic laws which operate independently of the human will. This distinction is sometimes seen as a distinction between two complementary but separable aspects of Marx's project, between his philosophical critique and his scientific theory. And sometimes it is seen as a radical opposition between two antithetical perspectives, between his youthful humanism and his mature naturalism. In either case, Capital is read primarily as a work of technical economics, while Marx's critique of political economy is read as an extrinsic critique, based on a human nature which is denied by the subordination of human values to economic constraints, and or on the objective material interests of the proletariat, which is subordinated to the domination of capital, leading to the reinterpretation of political economy from a different perspective, whether that of an alternative conception of human nature or that of a different class. In the former case, Marx's mature works dilute or even deny his early critique to the extent that Marx looks to economic interests as the basis of human liberation. In the latter case, his mature works overcome the immature romanticism of the early critique, for precisely the same reason. Both of these interpretations lead to a distinction between Marx's so-called philosophy of history, which defines the ontological primacy and historical variability of social relations of production, his, quote, sociology, which considers historically specific configurations of these social relations, and his, quote, economics, which defines the underlying economic, quote, laws of motion, which determine the development of these social relations. Sweezy, in his classic exposition of Capital, stresses the historical character of Marx's method, but goes on radically to distinguish the, quote, quantitative value problem from the, quote, qualitative value problem. Thus, Smith saw in the case of exchange value, quote, the quantitative relation between products, end quote. While Marx saw, quote, hidden behind this, a specific historically conditioned relation between producers, end quote. Sweezy and Dobb. Ernest Mandel follows the orthodox tradition, Bogdanov and Kautsky, in locating Marx's, quote, economics historically by prefacing his exposition with a summary of the historical origins of capitalism. According to this interpretation, the fundamental error of political economy lay not in political economy's characterization of the, quote, economic laws of capitalism, nor even in political economy's characterization of the social relations of capitalist production, but in its philosophy of history, which ignored the historically specific character of the social relations of capitalist production based on the private appropriation of the means of production. The failure of political economy lies, quote, in its failure to see and take account of the historical character of the facts on which it is based, end quote. So that the, quote, unhistorical and antisocial character of bourgeois thought, end quote, is revealed as soon as, quote, we consider the problem of the present as a historical problem, end quote. Lukács. This orthodox interpretation is clearly and concisely presented in a recent Soviet textbook which tells us that the precondition of Marx's, quote, revolution in economic science, end quote, was, quote, a revolution in philosophy, end quote. The, quote, application of the method of dialectical and historical materialism, and a historical approach to the analysis of phenomena, made it possible to define the true subject matter of political economy, and to reveal the laws of economic life, end quote. This enabled Marx and Engels to identify the historically specific character of the social relations of production, which, quote, are determined primarily by who owns the means of production. Ownership of the means of production underlies the social relations between people at all stages of social development. It is the development of the means of production that necessitates changes in property relations and sum total of social relations. Property relations, in turn, affect the development of the means of production when the form of ownership corresponds to the given level of development of the productive forces. It facilitates their progress. If property relations are obsolete, property relations act as a brake on the development of the productive forces, end quote. Kozlov, 1977. The problem with this interpretation is that it makes Marx indistinguishable from Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo, as noted by Coletti. Smith was quite clear that the social relations of production were determined by the form of ownership of the means of production, and that they develop historically on the basis of the development of forms of property, which in turn express the development of the forces of production. Smith was equally clear that, quote, obsolete property relations act as a brake on the development of the productive forces, end quote. For this was the basis of Smith's critique of feudalism and mercantilism. Smith also recognized the evils of capitalism, but regarded the evils of capitalism as unavoidable features of the best of all possible worlds. Malthus was well aware of the possibility of replacing private property by forms of communal property. Malthus's law of population being designed precisely to establish that the cooperative schemes of William Godwin would act as a fetter on the development of the productive forces by dissipating the surplus in the form of unproductive consumption. Ricardo described the contradictory character of capitalist production on the basis of his unequivocal commitment to the labor theory of value. Like Smith and Malthus, believed that socialism would lead only to an equalization of poverty. All that this interpretation leaves for Marx is his introduction of the distinction between labor and labor power, which Ricardo had confused. This discovery enabled Marx to, quote, prove his theory of exploitation by showing that profit derives from the surplus labor of the worker, appropriated by the capitalist without equivalent, and to complete the Ricardian system by resolving the contradictions inherent in Ricardo's exposition of the theory of value. This orthodox interpretation of Marx is shared by the majority of Marx's critics, who assimilate Marx to classical political economy and then condemn Marx and classical political economy to the same fate. Thus Schumpeter distinguished Marx's sociological definition of capitalism, which located the institutional framework of capitalism historically, from his, quote, economic theory, which explained, quote, the mechanics of capitalist society, end quote, and which derived from Ricardo, whose theory of value is the cornerstone of Marx's Capital, according to Schumpeter, and approved by Maurice Daub. The result is that the work of Marx, as the last of the classical economists, stands or falls with Ricardo's labor theory of value, a theory which, argue the critics, was most definitively superseded by the marginalist revolution in economics, whose critique of Ricardo was devastatingly applied to Marx by Böhm-Bawerk. The orthodox response to such criticism has been to defend the Ricardian theory against the marginalist onslaught, either on, quote, scientific grounds of the technical superiority of a properly corrected labor theory of value, or on the so-called philosophical grounds that the labor theory of value expresses a particular class perspective and or expresses the ontological primacy of production over exchange. Thus, the, quote, Marxist economics of the 1970s was dominated by an increasingly sterile debate about the, quote, neo-Ricardians, who took the former view, and the, quote, fundamentalists, who took the latter view. In the same way, the defense of so-called historical materialism is reduced to the defense of the, quote, mechanical materialism of the Scottish Enlightenment, an interpretation developed by the, quote, analytical Marxists, who try to reconstruct Marxism on the basis of Smith's individualistic and rationalist materialism. Examples being G.A. Cohen, John Romer, and John Elster. The interpretation of Marx's early works developed in the last chapter implies a quite different view of Marx's mature works. There is a difference between the philosophical character of Marx's early critique of political economy and the historical character of the intrinsic critique developed in Capital. But the two are different stages of the same project, a project clearly mapped out in the early works. The philosophical character of the early works derives from the fact that Marx had not yet given his philosophical categories any historical content. The extent to which Marx abandoned these categories in his mature works does not mark the extent to which he had broken with his early project, but the extent to which he had fulfilled his earlier project. At the heart of this difference in interpretation lies the role of the labor theory of value in Marx's mature work. In his early work, Marx used his theory of alienated labor as the basis of a critique of Ricardo's labor theory of value. Yet according to the orthodox interpretation, the labor theory of value is the foundation of Marx's mature theory of capitalism. Does this mean that Marx abandoned his early critique of the labor theory of value? Or does it mean that he retained his early critique of the labor theory of value, only to set the labor theory of value in its historical context? Or does Marx's critique transform the classical theory of value? The critique of political economy and the labor theory of value. The critique of political economy and the labor theory of value. I argued in the last chapter that Marx's critique of alienated labor defines a quite different project from that of simply reinterpreting political economy from a different class viewpoint. Far from defining the historical form of the social relations of capitalist production on the basis of the private ownership of the means of production, Marx insisted clearly and unequivocally that this was precisely the source of the errors of political economy, which failed to see that private property was only the expression of alienated labor. Thus, far from Marx adopting Ricardo's labor theory of value, the key to Marx's critique of political economy was his critique of that theory. Marx followed Ricardo in making labor the starting point of his theory of capitalist society. But Marx's labor was quite different from that of Ricardo. Where Ricardo's labor was the labor time of the individual embodied in the product of her labor, which thereby constituted that product as her property, Marx's labor was not individual but social labor. The attribution of that labor to the individual only appearing in the form of the attribution of a value to the commodity. It is only in the alienated social form of commodity production that labor's own activity, as a part of social labor, confronts the laborer in the form of a quality, value, of a thing, the commodity, which can thereby be appropriated as private property. Thus, Marx does not provide an external socio-historical critique of political economy, which leaves intact the field of the, quote, economy as the object of analysis, alongside, quote, society and, quote, history. For the, quote, economy, the world of quantitative relations between things can only be understood as the alienated social form of the reproduction of social relations of production. Marx's critique of political economy does not create a space for a Marxist political economy, since political economy can never do more than describe the alienated forms of social existence. Far from adopting the labor theory of value to prove the exploitation of the working class, Marx's critique of Ricardo undermines any such proof, both philosophically in undermining the liberal theory of property, which sees labor as the basis of proprietorial rights, and theoretically in removing the immediate connection between the expenditure of individual labor and the value of the commodity. I lost my spot. I'm going to repeat that whole bit. Far from adopting the labor theory of value to, quote, prove the exploitation of the working class, Marx's critique of Ricardo undermines any such proof. both philosophically and undermining the liberal theory of property, which sees labor as the basis of proprietorial rights, and theoretically, in removing the immediate connection between the expenditure of individual labor and the value of the commodity, so that the relationship between, quote, effort and, quote, reward can only be constituted socially. Thus, Marx was harshly critical of, quote, Ricardian socialism, which proclaimed labor's entitlement to its product, arguing that such a right was only a bourgeois right, expressing bourgeois property relations. For Marx, what was at issue was not ethical proofs of exploitation, whose existence requires no such proof, since it is manifested daily in the contradictions between the growing wealth created by social labor and the relative impoverishment of the working class, but, quote, to prove concretely how in present capitalist society the material, etc., conditions have at last been created which enable and compel the worker to lift this social curse, end quote. Marx. The scientific achievement of Ricardo for Marx was that he unflinchingly described the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, recognizing the pauperization of the working class as the condition for the accumulation of capital, recognizing the need for periodic crises, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and the creation of technological unemployment as necessary features of capitalism. The weakness of Ricardo's theory lay precisely in his labor theory of value, which provided a basis on which Ricardo could describe the effects of alienated labor to the extent that he reduced the concepts of value, wages, rent, and profit to labor, but provided no means by which he could explain them. Ricardo could not explain them because his theory identified labor immediately with labor's social forms, plural, as value, wages, rent, and profit. This is the source of the contradictions which Ricardo's theory could never resolve, because he could not grasp the socio-historical foundation and the limits of these social forms as forms of alienated labor. It was his critique of alienated labor which enabled Marx to overcome these limitations in his mature analysis of the value form, because it is through the theory of value that labor is connected with labor's alienated forms. Even in his lifetime, Marx was constantly exasperated by the failure of his readers and his critics to grasp the significance of his analysis of the value form. His analysis was first developed in the Grundrisse and was first published in a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. However, the critique, to Marx's distress, had little impact. Marx further developed his ideas in the manuscripts later published as Theories of Surplus Value. In the first edition of Capital, Marx summarized the argument in the text, and at the last minute added a, quote, schoolmasterly appendix, which presented the argument as, quote, simply as possible, end quote. This met with an equal incomprehension, so that Marx integrated the appendix into a rewritten first part of the second edition of Capital. This last attempt is the most confusing for all of the reader. This last attempt is the most confusing of all for the reader, because this last attempt separates the exposition of labor as the substance of value, with which the chapter begins, from the exposition of the form of value which follows, despite the fact that it is only through the value form that labor is constituted socially as the substance of value. Thus, the exposition can easily be read as radically distinguishing the, quote, quantitative value problem, constituted by the economic analysis of labor as the substance of value, from the, quote, qualitative value problem, constituted by the analysis of the historically specific form of value. However, Marx insists that labor is not in itself value, nor is labor in itself the source of wages, rent, and profit. The relationship between labor and labor's social form is not an immediate one. The relationship between labor and labor's social forms is a relationship that is mediated by the particular social relationships within which the expenditure of labor power and appropriation of the products of labor take place in a particular society. The case of the critique of political economy is to go beyond the analytical moment of the classics in order to show how it is that in a particular kind of society, labor appears in the alienated form of value. The foundation critique of political economy is therefore the investigation of the, quote, form of value that the classics took for granted. For this is the fundamental social reality of the alienation of labor. On the basis of this investigation, it becomes possible to locate the relations of the production, distribution, and circulation of things in a capitalist society as the alienated forms of social relations between people. The analysis of the value form makes it possible to go beyond the, quote, external critique of political economy of Marx's early works and of most of his interpreters. The analysis of the value form does not simply add a historical and sociological dimension that was neglected by the classical writers. The substance of the classical theory is transformed through the critique, for the process through which the economic categories are determined are no longer natural processes of subsistence need, of fertility of the soil, of demographic increase. The economic categories are determined socially, and so the factors involved in the economic categories' determination are quite different from the factors identified by the classical writers. In revealing the social determination of these categories, the critique of political economy uncovers the social foundations of the laws of development of capitalism. In so doing, the critique of political economy is able to resolve the contradictions that plagued classical political economy. It does this by showing that these contradictions within theory arise from the attempt to deny the existence of real contradictions in capitalist society. That is, from the attempt to show the process of capitalist development as a harmonious and coordinated process. Correspondingly, once it is recognized that economic laws are not natural, but social laws, it becomes to be recognized that these laws do not determine the fate of humanity, but only the fate of a particular form of society. Marx's critique of political economy, centered on the critique of the labor theory of value, is the core of Marx's theory of capitalist society. Marx's critique of political economy is not primarily a critique of the adequacy of classical political economy as economic theory, although it does give rise to important economic conclusions. And Marx anticipated most of the valid criticisms of the classical school that came to be formulated by later economists of the wages fund doctrine, the Malthusian law of population, the neglect of the role of the market, the theory of money, Say's law, etc. Above all, it is a critique of the classical conception of society that rested on the naturalism of the classical theory of value. In Capital, Marx laid the foundations of a quite different approach to capitalist society. It is this approach that I hope to elucidate in this chapter. The magnitude of value and the form of value. According to Marx, Ricardo's great contribution to political economy was that he discovered the key to the, quote, obscure structure of the bourgeois economic system, end quote, in the, quote, determination of value by labor time, end quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2. However, Ricardo's theory of value was formulated in abstraction from the social relations within which things come to acquire value as commodities. Thus, the Ricardian theory of value is based on the, quote, formal abstraction of, quote, production, in which the expenditure of labor time is considered independently of the social form of production, as a technical characteristic of the production process. The value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor required for that commodity's production, given the knowledge, techniques, and implements available, irrespective of the form of society within which the thing is produced. The concept of value is therefore essentially a technological concept, determined prior to and independently of the social relations between the producers, in accordance with the productivity of labor. Ricardo's naturalistic theory of value overlooked the fact that it is only in a particular kind of society that the products of labor take on the form of commodities and appear as values. It is not labor in general that appears in the form of value, but commodity-producing labor. Thus, Ricardo ignored the fact that value is only determined as such within particular social relations. Ricardo, quote, does not examine the form, the peculiar characteristic of labor that creates exchange value, or manifests itself in exchange values, the nature of this labor, end quote. Marx did not simply add consideration of the form of value to Ricardo's labor theory of value. Once we consider the form of value, we realize that the substance of value is not the labor embodied in the commodity. Quote, the materialization of labor is not to be taken in such a Scottish sense as Adam Smith conceives it. When we speak of the commodity as the materialization of labor, in the sense of the commodity's exchange value, this itself is only an imaginary. That is to say, a purely social mode of existence of the commodity, which has nothing to do with the commodity's corporeal reality. It is conceived as a definite quantity of social labor or of money. The mystification here arises from the fact that a social relation appears in the form of a thing, end quote. The substance of labor is not embodied labor, but the labor time socially necessary to produce the commodity. The distinction between, quote, embodied labor and, quote, socially necessary labor time appears at first sight to be a technical distinction of interest only to economists. The distinction between embodied labor and socially necessary labor time, however, is fundamental because it expresses the distinction between the naturalistic conception of value as the labor embodied in the commodity as a thing, and the socio-historical conception of value as the labor that is socially attributed to the thing as a commodity. The labor that is the source of value is not embodied labor as a universal substance. Value is labor for others, labor insofar as that labor is socially recognized within a division of labor, labor whose social character has been abstracted from the activity of the labor to confront the labor as the property of a thing, labor whose human qualities have been reduced to the single quality of duration, dehumanized, homogeneous, in short, alienated labor. The social foundation of value is precisely the alienation of labor that Marx had analyzed in 1844. In 1844, Marx had shown that the hidden presupposition of classical political economy was the concept of private property, and that the foundation of private property was alienated labor. In the critique of the classical theory of value, this argument is made more concrete. The social foundation of value, that's some good thunder right there. The social foundation of value is an extended division of labor within which social production is regulated through the exchange of commodities. The individual member of society does not produce directly for society according to some self-consciously regulated plan. Rather, the individual produces privately. However, the product is not destined for the producer's own use. The product can only function as a use value within the system of social production. Despite the product's private production, therefore, it has been produced for the use of others, and it is only as such that it can serve as a useful product. Thus, the commodity is necessarily a social product, and the labor which produces the commodity is necessarily a part of social labor. As a thing, the commodity is a useful object, product of the concrete useful labor of an immediate producer. However, the commodity cannot serve directly as a use value. The commodity can only become a use value by being exchanged as a value. Hence, within a commodity-producing society, the social productions of use values, and so the satisfaction of human needs, is only achieved in the alienated form of the private production of commodities as values. The mysteries of the commodity arise because the social relations within which commodities are determined as values are not immediately apparent. Although value is attributed to a commodity within a social relation of exchange, it is a matter of accident with whom any particular exchange is made. The individual producer is not concerned with who buys the product, but is concerned only to realize the product's value. The individual has a determinate relationship with the commodity as a value, but a purely accidental relationship with other producers. The value of the commodity then appears to be a property inherent in the relation between the private individual and the commodity as a thing. As Engels argued in his early critique of political economy, the, quote, labor theory of value, end quote, derives the value of the commodity one-sidedly from the relationship between the commodity and the laborer as producer. The theory of utility derives it equally one-sided from the relationship between the commodity and the purchaser as consumer. In each case, the value of the commodity appears to be independent of the social relations of production. The relations between people appear to arise because the commodity has a value as product of labor on the one side and as object of desire on the other. Hence the social powers of the commodity that derive from the social relations of commodity production appear to be inherent in the commodity as a thing. This is the origin of the, quote, fetishism of commodities, end quote. The failure of the classical political economists to investigate the connection between social labor and social labor's alienated forms prevented the classical political economists from penetrating the illusions of the fetishism of commodities. It was this failure to explore the social determination of value that led them to naturalize capitalist social relations. Quote, even its best representatives, Adam Smith and Ricardo, treat the form of value as something of indifference, something external to the nature of the commodity itself. The explanation for this is not simply that Smith and Ricardo's attention is entirely absorbed by the analysis of the magnitude of value. It lies deeper. The value form of the product of labor is the most abstract, but also the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production. By that fact, it stamps the bourgeois mode of production as a particular kind of social production of a historical and transitory character. If we then make the mistake of treating the bourgeois mode of production as the eternal natural form of social production, we necessarily overlook the specificity of the value form, and consequently of the commodity form together with its further developments, the money form, the capital form, etc. End quote. Capital Volume 1. Commodity fetishism is the form of appearance of particular social relations of production. But commodity fetishism is not merely an illusion. It really is the case that the relations between individuals and things are determinate, while the relationships between particular people are accidental. It really is the case that the social fate of the individual is determined by the fate of the commodities she possesses. Thus, it really is the case that the social relations are mediated by relations between things. The illusion lies not in the fact of the social power of the commodity, but in the belief that this social power derives from the commodity as a thing, rather than being seen as the particular form of alienated social relations. To understand the value form, we need to look more closely at the social form of commodity exchange, and in particular, uncover the secret of money in which the power of the commodity is expressed in its most abstract and universal form. Money as a social relation. Classical political economy failed to penetrate the fetishism of commodities, and so classical political economy was unable to identify the specific character of exchange as a form of the social relation of commodity production. This underlies the failure of classical political economy to understand money as a form of social relation. For classical political economy, the exchange relation was essentially symmetrical. The two parties to an exchange each had commodities that were wanted by the other. Each party could therefore satisfy his or her needs by exchanging commodities, and the rate at which they exchanged was determined by the amount of labor time each had spent on acquiring the given commodities. Here a double exchange took place. On the one hand, one kind of use value was exchanged for another, and this was the form of exchange. On the other hand, one private labor was exchanged for another private labor, and this was the quantitative determination, the content of exchange. Classical political economy was based on this picture of exchange as an essentially private relation of barter between individuals. The developed system of exchange found in a capitalist society is simply a generalization of this elementary private barter, into which money has been introduced as a technical instrument to facilitate the coordination of needs. For Marx, this model of exchange was nonsense. Where isolated individuals made occasional exchanges, in the parable of classical political economy, there was no reason why exchange ratios should correspond to the quantity of labor embodied in the particular commodities. For it was only within a competitive system of exchange that there was a tendency for exchange ratios to achieve such a quantitative determinacy. But within any system of exchange, quote, private interest is itself already a socially determined interest, which can be achieved only within the conditions laid down by society and with the means provided by society. Hence it is bound to the reproduction of these conditions and means. It is the interest of private persons, but its content, as well as the form and means of its realization, is given by social conditions independently of all. End quote. Grundrisse. In any developed system of exchange, the exchange relation does not comprise two separate exchanges, of use values on the one hand, and of labor time values on the other. Rather, there is a single but asymmetrical exchange. If I bring a commodity to market, I am not concerned with the use value of the commodity, but only with my commodity's value. For me, the commodity is a means of acquiring other commodities. On the other hand, in making an exchange, I seek to trade my commodity, which has no use for me, for another commodity which I can use. But the other commodity therefore exists for me as a potential use value. This is the process of exchange I seek to realize. Thus, in the process of exchange, I seek to realize my commodity as a value in order to acquire another commodity which can serve as a use value for me. The whole point of the system of exchange is that it does not, as in the classical parable, coordinate needs with one another through the direct exchange of use values. Needs are related in an alienated form, only through the mediation of value. Thus, even within the direct exchange of commodities, there is a fundamental asymmetry that already contains the possibility that exchange will not prove as harmonious as the classical parable would lead us to believe. As soon as we move away from the classical parable and consider exchange as a social process, it becomes clear that the process of exchange, in its simplest form, cannot be reduced to the isolated exchange of one commodity for another. When I take a commodity to market, I take the product of a certain quantity of concrete labor which I want to exchange. I hope that in exchanging my commodity I will be compensated for the amount of labor I have actually expended. In other words, I seek to represent my commodity as the embodiment of abstract socially necessary labor time, and not simply as the product of my particular concrete labor. This is the key to the understanding of money. In seeking to make an exchange in which another commodity will serve as equivalent for my commodity, I will not consider the amount of concrete labor actually embodied in that commodity. I will consider that commodity as an embodiment of abstract labor, of socially necessary labor time. I will not be swayed by the observation that the producer of the commodity has, in fact, taken much longer than the time socially necessary for on entering the market, the equivalent is detached from the equivalent's concrete conditions of production. Examination of exchange as a social relation makes it clear that the commodity which acts as the equivalent for my commodity does not appear as a particular commodity in the exchange relation, but represents the social world of commodities, in which my commodity has to play its part. Thus, the equivalent commodity appears in the exchange relation as the embodiment of abstract labor, a portion of the labor of society as a whole, and my commodity seeks to represent its value in the bodily form of the equivalent. It is only within the exchange relation, within which the other commodity acts as equivalent, that the latter has this social power. Outside that relation and its role of equivalent, it is simply a particular commodity like any other. The conclusion of Marx's analysis of the equivalent form is that any commodity can act as equivalent, and that money is indeed simply a commodity like any other. However, the properties that are attributed to money as the universal equivalent, the embodiment of human labor in the abstract, are not inherent in money as a particular commodity. They are properties that derive from money's social role as equivalent, as properties of the equivalent form. If we consider money in isolation from the form of exchange, we fall into the errors of the political economist. The mercantilist thought that gold embodied value in itself. For the mercantilist, therefore, the exchange value of a commodity was determined solely in the market by the relation established between the particular commodity and the money as the substance of value, The value of a commodity was the amount of money for which that commodity could be exchanged. Classical political economy ridiculed the monetarist superstition, noted that gold was a commodity like any other, and so regarded that exchange value, and so argued that exchange value is simply the ratio of the values of two particular commodities, one of which happens, for convenience, to be gold. For monetarism and mercantilism, the exchange value of a commodity was the accidental relationship established in the market. For the classical school, value was immanent in the commodity, and the market was simply the arena in which value expressed itself. Marx insisted that neither of these conceptions of exchange, and so of money, was adequate. Classical political economy was right to note that the money commodity was a particular commodity like any other. But the monetarists were right to note that money appeared in exchange not as a particular commodity, but as a universal, as the embodiment of value. The paradox is resolved when it is realized that money acquires its powers, not through money's own properties, but because of money's social role in the system of exchange. It is only in money's function as universal equivalent that money comes to acquire its power as embodiment of value. This power can consequently only be a social power. The relationship of the commodity to money can only express a social relation. And the development of money is the result of the development of the social relations of commodity production. The social relation that is expressed in the form of money is the relation between the labor of the individual and the labor of society. It is by submitting the commodity to the test of the market that private labor is submitted to the test of that private labor's social usefulness and of that private labor's social necessity. And that private labor seeks validation as abstract social labor. In this relationship, there is no guarantee that the individual labor will be validated in this way. So there is no guarantee either that the labor time socially necessary will correspond to that actually expended, or that the labor will prove socially useful in responding to social need as expressed in the market. It is only through the regular divergence of prices from values and of values from labor times embodied in particular commodities that the social regulation of production in a commodity-producing society is achieved. The divergence between price and value which classical political economy treated as accidental and insignificant, is therefore a necessary characteristic of the alienated character of commodity production. The formal abstractions of political economy that lead political economy to treat money as simply a technical instrument eliminate from view the contradictory foundation of a commodity-producing society that is the source of the crises that punctuate capitalist development. For political economy, which treats production in abstraction from its social form, the only barriers to the indefinite expansion of production are natural barriers, specifically the barrier established by the Malthusian relationship between the natural growth of population and the fertility of the soil. On the other hand, exchange, which is reduced to a purely formal transaction, is considered to be wholly unproblematic. Classical political economy could only conclude that periodic crises are accidental and irrational phenomena, expressing human imperfection rather than expressing the normal operation of an alienated and irrational form of social production. It is only when exchange is considered as a particular moment of the social relations of production that the exchange of the commodity for money becomes problematic. In a hypothetical society of petty commodity producers, in which the exchange of commodities is the exchange of things between individuals seeking to satisfy their needs, prices may rise and fall in response to accidental disruptions in the relation between demand and supply. However, in a capitalist society, which is the only type of society in which commodity production exists in commodity production's developed form, exchange no longer coordinates social production with social need, but involves, on the one hand, capitalists who are seeking to produce and reproduce capital and surplus value, and on the other hand, workers who are seeking to reproduce themselves by selling their labor power as a commodity in order to be able to purchase the means of subsistence from capitalists. The breakdown of exchange is not simply a superficial disturbance in the relations between the producers and the consumers of things, but an inherent aspect of the regulation of social production. The breakdown of exchange arises because of the contradictory foundation on which that society is built. That things will only be produced in exchange to the extent that those things can play their part in the production of surplus value and the reproduction of capitalist social relations. A crisis is not, therefore, simply an economic phenomenon. A crisis is an interruption in the reproduction of the social relations of capitalist society. A crisis, it is ultimately the neglect of the commodity form that prevents classical political economy from uncovering the contradictions inherent in the value form that come to a head in crises. Quote, if Ricardo thinks that the commodity form makes no difference to the product, and furthermore, that commodity circulation differs only formally from barter, that in this context exchange value is only a fleeting form of the exchange of things, and that money is therefore merely a formal means of circulation, then this in fact is in line with Ricardo's presupposition that the bourgeois mode of production is the absolute mode of production. Hence, it is a mode of production without any definite specific characteristics. The bourgeois mode of production's distinctive traits are purely formal. Ricardo cannot, therefore, admit that the bourgeois mode of production contains, within itself, a barrier to the free development of the productive forces, a barrier which comes to the surface in crises. The theory of value and the theory of society. The analysis of the value form and the demystification of money as the most abstract form of value brought to fruition the critique of political economy inaugurated in the comments on James Mill. However, the analysis of the value form form's implications are much wider than may appear at first sight, for it is not primarily a critique of the adequacy of political economy as an economic theory, nor is the analysis of the value form simply a critique that complements political economy in drawing attention to the social and historical context within which economic activity takes place. It is essentially a critique of the liberal conception of society on which classical political economy is based, and to this extent is a criticism of all bourgeois social thought. At the risk of repetition, it is worth recalling the theoretical structure of political economy. Classical political economy develops a theory of society on the basis of the formal abstractions of the individual, private property, production, and of exchange. The foundation of classical political economy is the conception of the private property owner as an abstract individual, unconstrained by imposed obligations, who is capable of making and of acting on her own rational judgments. The individual is inserted in the relations of production, distribution, and exchange, on the basis of her ownership of physical things, which can serve as factors of production. Thus, the social relations of capitalist production, distribution, and exchange exist independently of persons as relations between things. Production is reduced to the technical process of the production of things, while exchange is treated as a mechanism through which those things are exchanged for one another on the basis of the physical labor time embodied in them. These relations between things are expressed in the form of social relations between persons through the development of private property, by which persons are attached to those things as owners, and thereby enter social relations independent of their will. This leads to the fundamental conclusion of political economy, that the fundamental conclusion of political economy, that the condition of the realization of the productive potential inherent in the technical conditions of production, through the extension of the division of labor and the application of machinery, is the freedom of the individual property owner to dispose of her property according to private judgments of individual self-interest. Capitalist private property is therefore a juridical institution that imposes no social constraints, an expression of the reason that is the defining character of human nature. Thus the social relations of capitalist production, embodied in the freedom and security of private property, are naturalized and presented as the free expression of human rationality in the face of the objective constraints imposed by an external nature. Moreover, these social relations also express the moral ideal, since they leave the individual to be the judge of her own interest, while providing the means by which such interests can be optimally reconciled. Classical political economy is not simply a theory of capitalist economic relations. The realization of human rationality through capitalist relations of production, distribution, and exchange presupposes the freedom and security of property on the one hand, and the freedom of the individual from external moral and political constraint on the other. It therefore defines the constitutional, legal, and political circumstances within which rational judgments of self-interest can be made and acted on, and derives moral imperatives from the rational self-interest of the abstract individual that can serve as the basis of education, enlightenment, and legal regulation. Thus, classical political economy offers a liberal theory of this ideal society that can reconcile the necessity of legal, political, and moral constraint with the freedom of the individual by establishing that such constraint corresponds to the rational self-interest of the enlightened individual. Classical political economy develops a complete mode of capitalist society as the expression of human reason. Classical political economy describes, quote, a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. The coherence of this liberal model of society rests on the coherence of its starting point. The presupposition that capitalist social relations can be analyzed as relations between private individuals, related as property owners through the things which they own. It is this presupposition that Marx undermined with his critique of alienated labor, which showed that private property is not a juridical relation between a person and a thing, but a form of social relation in which the relation of the owner to the thing owned is subordinate to the social relations between commodity producers. It is this critique that is given positive substance by the development of the analysis of the so-called fetishism of commodities, quote, fetishism of commodities in Capital. According to political economy, the property relation is constituted in the act of production. As the producer appropriates nature through labor, and appropriates the product of that labor in the form of private property. In abstraction from the system of social production, this property relation indeed appears to be a private relation between an individual and a thing. However, this relation of appropriation is not a private relation. This relation of appropriation is not a private relation, for the thing has not been produced with a view to the thing's appropriation by that thing's producer, but with a view to exchange. The individual produces the thing as a commodity on the presupposition that others will also produce commodities and that the respective products will be exchangeable as commodities. The individual act of private production is only undertaken on the assumption that the individual will find available in the market the things necessary to satisfy her subsistence needs and to sustain a renewed round of commodity production. The individual act of production and appropriation, therefore, presupposes a social division of labor expressed in the total process of production and exchange of commodities. It is only in relation to this system of social production that the individual act of production and appropriation has any significance. And it is only on that basis that the product takes the form of private property. The presupposition of private property is therefore the social relation of commodity production. However, private property not only presupposes these social relations, private property not only presupposes these social relations, it is itself a form of social relations of commodity production. Liberal social theory and classical political economy fail to see this because liberal social theory and classical political economy fail to distinguish the commodity as a thing, a use value, from the commodity as a social relation, and correspondingly fail to distinguish the concrete labor embodied in the product from the abstract labor expressed in the form of the value of the commodity. The liberal theory of property is based on the immediate relation between concrete labor and the product as a thing. And it is this relation which is expressed in the Ricardian theory of embodied labor as the substance of value. However, the value of a commodity is not determined in this private relationship by the amount of labor concretely embodied in the product. The value of a commodity is only determined in the social relationship between producers, in which the commodity is attributed a value to the extent that it is recognized as the socially useful product of socially necessary labor. Outside this relationship, the commodity has no value, and so does not exist as property. Although the commodity that is appropriated as private property is indeed a thing, the commodity that is appropriated as private property, although the commodity that is appropriated as private property is indeed a thing, it is not as a thing that is appropriated as private property, but is a value. The commodity has not been produced to satisfy directly the needs of the producer, and it is worth nothing to the producer as a use value. It is only as the property of another that the commodity can be realized as a use value. Thus it has been produced as a commodity, not to serve directly as a use value, but to be exchanged as a value. And it is only to the extent that it can achieve social recognition as a value that it is worth appropriating as private property. The property relation is not, therefore, a private relation between an individual and a thing, but a social relation between an individual and a sum of value embodied in a thing, a relation of privatization of a portion of the social product, not a relation constructed in private. The relation of private property is the fetishized form taken by the relation between the individual and other producers within the social division of labor. The relation of exchange, within which the commodity is realized as private property is the relation within which the social character of private labor is realized as a moment of the social division of labor. However, if the commodity is viewed as a thing, if the commodity's social character is considered to be inherent in it as a thing, the social relations between the producers appear as relationships between things. And the social determination of the individual, the social determinations of the individual appear as natural laws, impervious to the human will. Human subjectivity is thereby reduced to individual rationality in the face of a world of natural constraint. Thus, the demystification of the fetishism of commodities is at the same time the demystification of the relation of private property, and the corresponding concept of the private individual that is at the foundation of liberal social theory. If the individual proprietor is necessarily a social being, with the social relations of production already presupposed in the property relation, the implication is that the theory of society must take as its starting point not the abstract individual, but the historically given social relations of production. Quote, individuals producing in society, hence socially determined individuals, is of course the point of departure, end quote. Grundrisse. Once it is recognized that the property relation is a social relation, it also becomes clear that different forms of property express different forms of social relation. These differences are suppressed in the abstract consideration of the individual as a property owner, a consideration which corresponds to the abstract model of an undifferentiated society of petty commodity producers, in which social relations are indeed relations of freedom and equality, however restricted their social and material base. The analysis of capitalist society cannot stop with the analysis of the abstract commodity form. The analysis of capitalist society also has to understand how the relations of freedom and equality expressed in that form, the abstract commodity form, turn into their opposite. Thus we have to turn from the analysis of value and of money to the analysis of capital. However, it is important to understand that in turning to capital, we are not leaving the analysis of the commodity form behind, for capital is only a further development of the contradictions inherent in the commodity form. Thus, the classical failure to understand the commodity form also explains the classical failure to understand the more developed form of value as capital. The classical model of a society of freedom and equality is not only abstract. The classical model of a society of freedom and equality, is also purely hypothetical. For commodity production rests on contradictory foundations. The emergence of money as the universal equivalent forms the immediate basis on which money can be withdrawn from circulation, to become a store of value, whether as savings from normal revenues or as a windfall deriving from particular good fortune. The accumulation of a monetary hoard gives the more frugal or the more fortunate a claim on the product of the less fortunate, and so becomes the basis on which inequalities will, unless checked by other social mechanisms, develop cumulatively. Money gives rise to credit, as those with money lend to those in need, and debt gives rise to dependence. The cushion of a monetary reserve ensures that good fortune becomes cumulative, allowing the wealthy to augment their hoards, while the poor fall ever deeper into debt. The lever of debt then provides a means by which the rich can appropriate the products of the labor of the poor, and eventually, by foreclosing on their loans, reduce the poor to the status of wage laborers. The freedom and equality of petty commodity production is transformed, according to the contradictory development of its own rationality, into the unfreedom and inequality of capitalism. Capital as a social relation. In analyzing the form of value, Marx abstracted from the specifically capitalist form of production, although it is only under capitalism that commodity production is generalized. In the analysis of value, Marx therefore made no reference to class relations, nor to the distribution of the value produced among the social classes. This abstraction is legitimate because capitalism is a form of commodity production. On the one hand, and because recognition of the capitalist form of production does not immediately affect the analysis of the commodity and the form of value on the other. However, we now have to ask how the social form of capitalist production expresses itself in distinctively capitalist relations of production and exchange. Marx introduced consideration of capital by examining capital in its most abstract form, capital's, quote, first form of appearance, as, quote, money capital. Money is not itself capital, but only becomes capital when money acquires the power of self-expansion. When money functions as the means of circulation of commodities, money has no such powers of self-expansion, nor does it if money is accumulated in an idle hoard. A sum of money can only be increased by throwing it into circulation, by buying some commodities and then withdrawing it again by selling commodities. Money therefore only becomes capital through this process, in which money expands in the course of its circulation. Quote, value, therefore, it now becomes value in process, money in process, and as such capital, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. In this process, a sum of value in the form of money is expended in the buying of commodities. And commodities are later sold in order to realize a greater sum of value in the form of money. In this process, a sum of value in the form of money is expended in the buying of commodities, and commodities are later sold in order to realize a greater sum of value in the form of money. Thus, a certain sum of value through this process begets a, quote, surplus value. The term, quote, capital refers to this process in which a sum of value apparently acquires the power of expanding itself. Money and commodities are not in themselves capital. Money and commodities are simply forms taken on by capital in the process of self-expansion. It is not the value of money, nor that of the commodities that increases in the process. Otherwise, there would be no need for capital to go through these changes of form to expand itself. To believe otherwise is to identify capital with one of its forms, to see capital as, quote, a thing not as a relation, end quote, Grundrisse, and so to succumb to the fetishism of commodities. Money and commodities only become capital when they participate in the process in which value expands itself. To understand capital, therefore, we have to understand this process of self-expansion of value. How does a sum of value, a quantity of abstract labor, manage to assimilate to itself more value in the course of that sum of value's circulation? This is only possible if at some point in that value's circulation, capital is able to appropriate labor without payment. The problem is where this occurs. This appropriation cannot take place within exchange, at least so far considered, because exchange does not create value. Exchange merely changes value's form. It is certainly the case that unequal exchanges could take place. But such exchanges could not yield a surplus value. Unequal exchanges could only redistribute a portion of an existing sum of value as gains and losses balanced out. The early forms of merchants' and usurers' capital were based on such a redistribution of value. New value can be added only by the expenditure of labor in production. Thus, the source of surplus value can only be a difference between the amount paid for the labor and the labor actively expended. However, this in turn seems impossible to explain, for it implies that labor is a commodity paid below that commodity's value, which raises the question of what is special about labor that prevents labor from being paid at its value. Marx solved this problem by examining carefully the social form of capitalist production, concluding that the commodity purchased by the capitalist was not labor, but labor power. When the capitalist employed the worker, there was not a symmetrical relation of production in which the worker sold her labor and the capitalist his, quote, capital to the enterprise, and each then shared in the product according to the contributions of labor and, quote, capital. What actually happened was that the worker sold to the capitalist her ability to work, her labor power, for a certain length of time. The capitalist used this capital to buy this labor power and the requisite means of production, which he then set to work to produce commodities. In selling her labor power, the worker had given up all rights to the product, so the entire product was appropriated by the capitalist. Thus, the capitalist form of the labor process, quote, exhibits two characteristic phenomena. Firstly, the worker works under the control of the capitalist, to whom his labor belongs. Secondly, the product is the property of the capitalist, and not that of the worker, the product's immediate producer, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. These characteristics derived from the fact that production was premised on the purchase and sale of labor power as a commodity. The difference between the labor power that the worker sells and the labor that the worker actually performs is the key to the understanding of surplus value. As a commodity, labor power has a unique characteristic in that the, quote, consumption of labor power is itself the expenditure of labor and so the production of value. Thus, labor power is paid for as a commodity at labor power's value, like any other commodity. But having been purchased, the labor power can be set to work to produce value in excess of its own value. The distinction between labor and labor power is no pedantic terminological distinction. The distinction between labor and labor power is an aspect of the fundamental distinction between use value and value, the confusion of which underlies the mystifications of political economy. Labor and labor power are distinct concepts because labor and labor power describe distinct objects, corresponding to distinct social the relationship between which is only established through particular social relations of production. Labor is the realization of the potential inherent in the capacity to labor. Where the laborers possess the requisite means of production and subsistence, the realization of this potential is subject only to the will of the laborers, individually and collectively. The historical separation of the laborer from the means of production and subsistence severs the immediate connection between labor power and labor. Labor power is now the object of an exchange relation between capitalist and wage laborer, in which the laborer sells her labor power in exchange for the value equivalent of the means of subsistence. In exchange for the wage, the capitalist acquires a title to the entire product of labor. However, on completion of the exchange, this product does not yet exist. This product can only come into being through the subjective exercise of the will of the laborers in the production of commodities. The contradiction which now arises is that the laborers have alienated all entitlement to the product of their labor to the capitalist, and so no longer have any interest in realizing the potential inherent in their capacity to labor. The capitalist, on the other hand, has to ensure that the laborers produce a sum of value exceeding that which he has laid out as capital, and to do this he has to subordinate the will of the laborers to his own will. The relationship between labor power and labor is only realized through this conflict of wills, which is fought out within the social relations which constitute the immediate production process. Ricardo's identification of labor power with labor abstracts from the necessarily antagonistic character of these social relations. It is important to notice that the theory of surplus value does not depend on the determination of value by labor time, but on the analysis of the social form of capitalist production, based on the distinction between labor and labor power, the value of which is determined quite independently of one another. Surplus value derives from the quantitative relationship between two quite distinct magnitudes, as the difference between the sum of value acquired by the capitalist from the sale of the product and the sum paid out in the purchase of labor power and means of production. The sum paid out in the purchase of labor power and means of production has to be paid out as the condition of production. The size of the former depends on the ability of the capitalist to compel the worker to work beyond the time necessary to produce a product equivalent in value to the sum initially laid out, to work beyond the time necessary to produce a product equivalent in value to the sum initially laid out, whatever may be the particular units in which value is measured. It is the capitalist form of the social determination of production which makes it appropriate to express the value of the product in terms of the expenditure of labor time, since it is capital, not Ricardo or Marx, which subordinates the concrete activity of labor to the expenditure of labor time. Thus, the validity of the labor theory of value, in quotes, the quote labor theory of value, is not the presupposition of the theory of surplus value, but the validity of the labor theory of value is the theory of surplus value's result, to the extent that the, quote, labor theory of value is the adequate theoretical expression of the social form of capitalist production. The distinction between labor and labor power makes it possible to overcome the contradictions of political economy. The distinction between labor and labor power makes it possible to overcome the contradictions of political economy by making it possible to reconcile the existence of profit with the equality of exchange. For Ricardo, wages correspond to the value of labor, so that labor has not one but two values: the value labor has in exchange and the value labor contributes to the product. Thus, its exchange value does not correspond to its value. This led the Ricardian socialists to conclude that labor is paid below its value and that this is the source of profit. The implication is that the source of exploitation is the inequality of exchange between labor and capital, and that exploitation can therefore be abolished by equalizing that exchange. By introducing the distinction between labor and labor power, Marx resolves this contradiction and shows that exploitation is consistent with equality of exchange, so that the abolition of exploitation depends on the abolition of the wage relation and not simply on the wage relation's equalization. The social foundation of labor power as a commodity is the separation of the laborer from the means of production and subsistence that compels the laborer to sell her labor power as a commodity in order to participate in social production and so gain access to means of subsistence. It is this separation that is consequently the social foundation of surplus value, and so of capital. Capital, like the commodity, is not a self-sufficient thing with inherent social powers, but a social relation that appears in the form of relations between things. The social relation that is concealed behind capital is, however, a new social relation, not the relationship between private producers concealed behind the commodity, but a relation between social classes. This class relation is the logical and historical presupposition of capitalist production, the social condition for the existence of individual capitalists and workers, and the basis on which the labor of one section of society is appropriated without equivalent by another. The foundation of this relation is the separation of the mass of the population from the means of production and subsistence. The capitalist labor process. Once the concept of capital is introduced, our understanding of production and exchange is further developed. Production is no longer under the control of the direct producer. The social presupposition of capitalist production is the separation of the direct producer from the means of production, so that the direct producer can only work under the direction of another, the capitalist. For the capitalist, the aim of production is not the production of use values, but the production of surplus value. The capitalist production of use values is only incidental to the capitalist production of surplus value. The capitalist labor process is no longer a process in which workers produce use values by setting the means of production to work. It becomes the process in which capital sets labor to work to produce value. Quote, "It is no longer the worker who employs the means of production, but the means of production which employ the worker." End quote. Capital. This domination of the worker by the thing in the labor process, which acquires a, quote, "technical and palpable reality," end quote, with the coming of machinery, should not be seen as a feature of the labor process as a technical process. The thing in this, as in other cases, can only acquire its social power within particular social relations. The power of the machine over the worker in the labor process is therefore only a form of the power of capital. The power of capital is in turn the power of alienated labor, of labor appropriated by the capitalist in the form of surplus value, and turned as capital into the means of appropriating more labor. Quote, "Hence the rule of the capitalist over the worker is the rule of things over man, of dead labor over living, of the product over the producer." End quote. It is only within the capitalist labor process that the process of production is completely subordinated to the production of value. And for the independent commodity producer, the labor process can still be endowed with some human qualities. In the capitalist labor process, the only criteria is labor time. And the attempt to reduce labor time spent to a minimum. It is this unqualified subjection of production to the production of value and of surplus value that characterizes the capitalist labor process. Production is therefore not in any way the technical arena of cooperation in the production of use values presented by classical political economy. It is a constant arena of struggle over the length of the working day, over the intensity of labor, over the degradation and dehumanization of labor, through which the worker seeks to resist her complete subordination to capital. The class struggle over production is not a matter of the subjective motivation of the capitalist, but is imposed on every capitalist by the pressure of competition, which is the expression of the tendency for capitalism to develop the forces of production without regard to the limits of the market. Capitalist production is not marked by the subordination of social production to social need, even as that is expressed in the restrictive form of, quote, "effective demand" in the market. For the purpose of the capitalist is not to meet social need, but to expand his capital. The pressure of competition forces every capitalist constantly to develop the forces of production, which leads to the general tendency for capital in every branch of production to develop the forces of production without limit, and in particular, without regard to the limits of the market. This tendency to the overproduction of commodities and the uneven development of the forces of production is only overcome by the expansion of the world market and the development of new needs, and by the regular destruction of productive capacity and redundancy of labor in the face of crises of overproduction. The development of capitalist production is subject neither to the needs of the associated producers nor to the needs of the associated producers as consumers, but to the contradictory logic of production and accumulation of surplus value. The tendency for capitalist competition to impose on every capitalist the need to reduce labor time to a minimum gives rise to two fundamental features of capitalist development. On the one hand, to increase the productivity of labor to an extent never before seen. On the other hand, the tendency to increase productivity, not for the benefit of, but at the expense of, the mass of the population. Thus, the increased productivity of labor is not expressed in a growing abundance of goods for the mass of the population, nor in a reduction in the burden of work. Instead, the increased productivity is expressed in a growing accumulation of capital at one pole of society and growing poverty, relative if not absolute, at the other pole. Increased productivity is expressed in an increased burden of work for those with jobs, alongside a growing, quote, reserve army of labor who have been made redundant and are condemned to idleness. The depreciation of machinery in the course of accumulation is matched by the throwing of workers onto the scrap heap. The more rapid is, quote, progress, the more rapidly is work dehumanized and workers degraded, exploited and cast aside. Capitalism makes possible unprecedented increases in the productive powers of labor. These increases are associated with an increasing scale of production, the application of machinery, and the application of science. These are characteristics of the greater socialization of production achieved under capitalism. But this socialization only takes place under the direction of capital, and the product of socialized labor is appropriated by the capitalist. Thus, the social powers of labor, which appear only when labor is organized socially, appear to be the powers of capital. Thus, the social powers of labor, which appear only when labor is organized socially, appear to be the powers of capital. Moreover, since capital in turn is seen as a thing and not a social relation, these powers of capital seem to be inherent in the means of production, so that productivity appears as a technical characteristic of the means of production and not as a social characteristic of the labor process. Quote, "The social configuration in which the individual workers exist does not belong to them. On the contrary, the social configuration in which the individual workers exist confront the individual workers as a capitalist arrangement that is imposed on them. And quite apart from the combination of labor, the social character of the conditions of labor, and this includes machinery and capital fixe of every kind, appears to be entirely autonomous and independent of the worker. It appears to be a mode of existence of capital itself. Therefore, as something ordered by capitalists, without reference to the workers, like the social character of their own labor, but to a far greater extent, the social character with which the conditions of production are endowed appears as capitalistic, as something independent of the workers and intrinsic to the conditions of production themselves. In the same way, science, which is in fact the general intellectual product of the social process, also appears to be the direct offshoot of capital. End quote. Capital, Volume 1, and Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 1. The capitalist process of exchange. Classical political economy considered exchange as a formal abstraction. The exchange relation was treated as a self-sufficient relation whose content was reduced to the exchange relation's formal properties. As such a formal abstraction, the exchange relation is a relation between free and equal individual property owners who enter a voluntary contract in pursuit of their own interests. The exchange relation in itself makes no reference to the circumstances in which the individual seeks to exchange, nor to the characteristics of the commodity offered for exchange, nor to the means by which the individual came upon that commodity. Since every exchange is freely entered by both parties, the exchange must be to the advantage of each, and the conclusion is therefore that unfettered exchange can only serve the common interest. In this simple form of exchange, quote, all inherent contradictions of bourgeois society appear extinguished. And bourgeois democracy, even more than the bourgeois economists, take refuge in this aspect in order to construct apologetics for the existing economic relations. Indeed, insofar as the commodity or labor is conceived of only as exchange value, then the individuals, the subjects between whom this process goes on, are simply and only conceived of as exchangers. As far as the formal character is concerned, there is no distinction between them. And this is the economic character, the aspect in which they stand towards one another in the exchange relation. It is the indicator of their social function or social relation towards one another. As subjects of exchange, their relation is therefore that of equality. It is impossible to find any trace of distinction, not to speak of contradiction between them, not even a difference. Furthermore, the commodities which they exchange are as exchange values equivalent, or at least count as equivalent. End quote. Grundrisse. If we look outside the act of exchange, we still cannot find any class relations. For according to this model, the relation of exchange brings together individuals who exchange a natural product in accordance with their natural needs. Quote, as regards the content outside the act of exchange, this content, which falls outside the specifically economic form, can only be one, the natural particularity of the commodity being exchanged, or two, the particular natural need of the exchangers. The content of the exchange, far from endangering the social equality of individuals, rather makes their natural difference into the basis of their social equality. In this respect, however, they are not indifferent to one another, but integrate with one another, so that they stand not only in an equal, but also in a social relation to one another. Insofar as these natural differences among individuals and among their commodities form the motive for the integration of these individuals, there enters, in addition to the quality of equality, that of freedom. End quote. Grundrisse. If we turn our attention from a society of independent commodity producers to a capitalist society in which labor power has become a commodity, there appears to be no significant changes in the exchange relation. The form of property remains apparently unchanged. Exchange still appears to relate free and equal commodity owners. Every exchange is voluntarily contracted and is, at least ideally, an exchange of equivalence. It would therefore seem to be legitimate to apply the liberal model of the free and equal society, based on the freedom and equality of exchange, to the capitalist society as much as to the society based on simple commodity production. The only difference now is that one more commodity has come onto the market. The worker selling not the products of her labor, but her labor power. But this commodity, like any other commodity, is exchanged freely and voluntarily. However, if we look at the process of exchange, not from the mythical point of view of the isolated individual, but in terms of the social relations that exchange articulates, matters appear very different. Quote, the illusion created by the money form vanishes immediately if instead of taking a single capitalist and a single worker, we take the whole capitalist class and the whole working class. End quote. Capital, Volume 1. If we isolate distinct acts of production and exchange from one another, we abstract them from the system of social production within which they take place. Such an abstraction would be forced, for to separate these acts from one another is to deprive these acts of any meaning. Each act of production or exchange only makes sense as a moment of the total process of social production. So the motive of each exchange can only be found in the process as a whole. The examining of the social form of capital has revealed the social foundations of capitalist production to lie in the class relation between capital and wage labor. This class relation is the presupposition of every individual act of production and exchange, and alone gives meaning to those acts. If the act of exchange is isolated from the reproduction of capitalist social relations of production, of which it is but one moment, the act itself becomes irrational. Thus, for example, the capitalist, as a capitalist, does not purchase labor power in order to enjoy the use value of that commodity directly. For labor power has a use value for the capitalist only in the process of production of surplus value. The capitalist does not produce commodities in order to satisfy his own consumption needs, but in order to expand his capital. Labor power is not a commodity like any other. Quote, here, we are not concerned merely with the social division of labor, in which each branch is autonomous, so that, for example, a cobbler becomes a seller of boots, but a buyer of leather or bread. What we are concerned with here is the division of the constituents of the process of production itself. Constituents that really belong together. End quote. Capital, Volume 1. This process, which is the basis of the class relation between capital and labor, represents a completely different social relation from that affected between independent commodity producers by the social division of labor. And so the production of capital expresses a completely different social relation from the production of commodities. Quote, in the actual commodity market, then, it is quite true that the worker, like any other owner of money, is a buyer and is distinguished by that fact alone from the commodity owner, a seller. But on the labor market, money always confronts him as capital, in the form of money, and so the owner of capital appears as capital personified, as a capitalist. And the capitalist, capital personified, for his part, I'm going to redo the whole quote because I'm getting confused. Sometimes I have to say sometimes when the word it is used a lot, I have to match up what it is actually was referring to, what was initially said, and then got mixed up. So I don't know. Maybe that's annoying to people listening, but for me it's pretty crucial because some fucking theoretical shit can get pretty dense, and if you can make it a little less dense for yourself, then you should. Anyway, quote, in the actual commodity market, then, it is quite true that the worker, like any other owner of money, is a buyer and is distinguished by that fact alone from the commodity owner as seller. But on the labor market, money always confronts the worker as capital in the form of money. And so the owner of capital appears as capital personified, as a capitalist. And he, for his part, appears to the owner of money merely as the personification of labor power, and hence of labor, i.e., as a worker. The two people who face each other on the marketplace, in the sphere of circulation, are not just a buyer and a seller, but capitalist and worker, who confront each other as buyer and seller. End quote. Capital, Volume 1. Thus, nobody enters exchange as a pre-social individual. We are from the beginning concerned with, quote, society, social relations based on class antagonism. These relations are not relations between individual and individual, but between worker and capitalist, between farmer and landlord, etc. Wipe out these relations, and you annihilate all society. End quote. Marx, Collected Works, Volume 6. When we look at the process of capitalist production as a whole, we find that the class relations are not only its presupposition, but also its result. The worker emerges from the process as he entered the process. The worker, quote, emerges from the process as he entered the process, namely as a merely subjective labor power, which must submit itself to the same process once more if it is to survive. In contrast to this, capital does not emerge from the process as it entered it. capital only becomes real capital in the course of the process. Capital now exists as capital realized in the form of the aggregate product, and as such as the property of the capitalist. It now confronts labor once more as an autonomous power, even though it was created by that very labor. Previously, the conditions of production confronted the worker as capital only in the sense that he found them existing as autonomous beings opposed to himself. What he now finds opposed to him is the product of his own labor. What had been the premise is now the result of the process of production. Therefore, it is not only true to say that labor produces on a constantly increasing scale the conditions of labor in opposition to labor's self in the form of capital, but equally, capital produces on a steadily increasing scale the productive wage laborers it requires. Labor produces the conditions of production in the form of capital, and capital produces labor, i.e. as wage labor, as the means towards capital's own realization as capital. End quote. Capital, Volume 1. The result is that the capitalist production process as a whole, seen as a social process which embraces both production and exchange, produces not only use values but values, not only values but surplus value, not only surplus value but the social relation of production between capital and labor. The capitalist form of property is both the premise and the result of capitalist production and exchange. Quote, this incessant reproduction, this perpetuation of the worker, is the absolute necessary condition for capitalist production, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. The capitalist form of property is still based on the freedom and equality of every commodity owner, and so is still compatible with the legal form of private property appropriate to simple commodity production, although it is the negation of freedom and equality. Quote, each individual transaction continues to conform to the laws of commodity exchange. With the capitalist always buying labor power and the worker always selling labor power at what we shall assume is its real value. It is quite evident from this that the laws of appropriation of private property, laws based on the production and circulation of commodities, become changed into their direct opposite through their own internal and inexorable dialectic. The exchange of equivalents, the original operation with which we started, is now turned around in such a way that there is only an apparent exchange. Since, firstly, the capital which is exchanged for labor power is itself merely a portion of the product of the labor of others which has been appropriated without an equivalent, and secondly, this capital must not only be replaced by its producer, the worker, but replaced together with an added surplus. The relation of exchange between capitalist and worker becomes a mere semblance belonging only to the process of circulation. The relation of exchange between capitalist and worker becomes a mere form, which is alien to the transaction itself and merely mystifies the transaction. The constant sale and purchase of labor power is the form. The content is the constant appropriation by the capitalist, without equivalent, of a portion of the labor of others which has already been objectified, and his repeated exchange of this labor for a greater quantity of the living labor of others. The separation of property from labor thus becomes the necessary consequence of a law that apparently originated in their identity. To the extent that commodity production, in accordance with its own immanent laws, undergoes a further development into capitalist production, the property laws of commodity production must undergo a dialectical inversion, so that the property laws of commodity production become laws of capitalist appropriation. This dispels the illusion that we are concerned here merely with relations between commodity owners. This constant sale and purchase of labor power, and the constant entrance of the commodity produced by the worker himself as buyer of his labor power, and as constant capital, appear merely as forms which mediate his subjugation by capital. End quote. Capital, Volume 1. The, quote, Trinity formula and the theory of class. On the basis of his investigation of the social form of the commodity, Marx was able to establish the historical specificity of capitalist social relations, and so to undermine the abstract naturalism of classical political economy. Marx's critique of political economy and capital culminates in the critique of the classical theory of class, a theory that Marx characterized by its reliance on the Trinity formula. Land gets rent, labor gets wages, capital gets profit. The classical theory of class is very different from that developed by Marx. Classical political economy constructs the theory of class, like the rest of its social theory, on a naturalistic foundation. Classes arise on the basis of a differentiation of functions in the technical division of labor. Thus, the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, are each considered to make specialized contributions to production, so that the social differentiation between the owners of these commodities is an expression of a supposedly technical differentiation between the factors of production. The existence and specific social functions of the three social classes, landowners, laborers, and capitalists, are then considered. The existence and specific social functions of the three social classes, landowners, laborers, wage laborers, there's a typo. The existence and specific social functions of the three social classes, landowners, wage laborers, and capitalists, it says was laborers, are then considered to be the inevitable consequence of the existence of land, labor, and means of production as, quote, factors of production and, quote, sources of revenue. The starting point of the Trinity formula is the perfectly accurate observation that revenues accrue to the owners of particular commodities. Thus, profit is the revenue that accrues to the owner of means of production. Interest, the revenue that accrues to the owner of money. Wages, the revenue that accrues to the owners of labor power. And rent, the revenue that accrues to the owners of land. However, the theory then abstracts from the social relations within which these things function, as commodities, and within which they alone appear as sources of revenues, to postulate that it is the things themselves that give rise to the revenues in question. Things acquire miraculous social powers as soon as they come into the possession of their owners. This is the culmination of the fetishism of commodities. Quote, the form of revenue and the sources of revenue are the most fetishistic expression of the relations of capitalist production. It is their form of existence, as it appears on the surface, divorced from the hidden connections and the intermediate connecting links. End quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3. However much the Trinity formula might accord with the illusions of the individuals engaged in capitalist social relations, it does not stand up to serious analysis. In the first place, it is not clear what properties of the commodities that serve as revenue sources give rise In the first place, it is not clear what properties of the commodities that serve as revenue sources give rise to their corresponding revenues. Thus, different versions of the theory attribute profit to, quote, capital, to, quote, money, or to the, quote, means of production. The source of profit is alternatively the, quote, abstinence of the capitalist, the labor of superintendence, the productive powers of the means of production, the roundaboutness of capitalistic methods of production, and the taking of risks, or simply the passage of time. The source of wages is variously the subsistence needs of the worker, the unpleasantness of work, or the productive powers of labor. The source of rent is variously the fertility of the soil, the progressive infertility of the soil, or the scarcity of land. There are, therefore, not one but many different versions of the Trinity formula, none of which can provide a satisfactory definition of the source of the revenue in question. More fundamentally, the formula is irrational, for things cannot have social powers unless these powers are bestowed on them by their insertion in particular social relations. It is only within particular social relations that things become commodities and are able to function as sources of revenue. Labor can only appear as the source of wages in a society in which labor power has become a commodity. In such a society, it is labor power, and not labor, whose sale gives rise to wages, and wages are determined in a competitive struggle between capitalists and workers, whose social identity is constituted by the class relation between a class that is able to monopolize the means of production and subsistence, and a class that is deprived of access to the means of production and subsistence, except through the sale of labor power. It is therefore only on the basis of the class relation between capital and labor that labor power becomes a commodity, and so a potential and not necessarily actual source of wages. The commodity labor power, whose value appears in the form of the wage, has nothing to do with the labor that is engaged as a factor in the production process. The laborer sells her labor power, not the product of her labor. The capitalist is contracted to pay for that labor power, so long as the capitalist has that labor power at his disposal. However, the capitalist may employ that labor power. The same is true of capital. Quote, capital is not a thing, but rather a definite social production relation, belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing and lends this thing a specific social character. Capital is not the sum of the material and produced means of production. Capital is rather the means of production transformed into capital, which in themselves are no more capital than gold or silver in itself is money. It is the means of production monopolized by a certain section of society. Confronting living labor power as products and working conditions rendered independent of this very labor power, which are personified through this antithesis in capital. End quote. Capital, Volume 3. The same is true of land, rent, as a share of the social product is supposed to derive from the natural properties of the soil. Land certainly contributes to the production of things, the fertility of the soil being a major determinant of the productivity of labor. But the soil cannot claim back its share. The share of rent can only be determined within definite social relations, and the share of rent will differ according to the form assumed by those relations. The capital relation and the capital relations forms. The Trinity formula is irrational because the Trinity formula isolates the individual act of exchange, within which the service of a productive factor is exchanged for a revenue, from the system of social production of which it is necessarily a part. However, this irrationality is not just the irrationality of the theories of political economy. For political economy merely expresses the irrationality of the fetishized forms in which capitalist social relations of production present themselves to individual experience. The individual act of exchange is indeed the basis and the limit of the immediate experience of the members of a capitalist society. However, in abstraction from the system of social production, the isolated act of exchange is irrational. So any attempt to explain the source of the revenue on the basis of that act can be irrational in its turn. Nevertheless, however irrational it may be, the Trinity formula accords accurately with a common sense interpretation of individual experience. The irrationality of the Trinity formula is therefore not merely the irrationality of political economy, but the irrationality of the Trinity formula reflects the alienated form of capitalist social relations. The critique of the Trinity formula has not simply to criticize the critique of the Trinity formula has not simply to criticize the Trinity formula as illusory and irrational, but also show how the Trinity formula arises as the culmination of the fetishism of commodities. In competitive exchange, the social character of the commodity is effaced. As a social relation is mediated through the exchange of things between private individuals. In the form of the commodity, a social relation assumes an objective and coercive power, which is fetishistically attributed to the commodity itself. This is as true of the relations within which the elements of production are exchanged as it is of the relations of exchange between commodity producers. The foundation of the illusion of the Trinity formula is the, quote, wage form, which is the form in which labor power is purchased and sold as a commodity. Since the worker is employed by the day, the week, the year, it appears as though the worker is being paid the full price of her labor and not for her labor power. Quote, the wage form thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid labor and unpaid labor. All labor appears as paid labor. We may therefore understand the decisive importance of the transformation of the value and price of labor power into the form of wages or into the value and price of labor itself. All the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all capitalism's illusions about freedom, all the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics, have as their basis the form of appearance discussed above, which makes the actual relations invisible, and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation. End quote. Capital Volume 1. The wage form is the basis of all the other illusions of the Trinity formula. Three illusions arise because it appears that labor has already been rewarded for its contribution in the form of the wage. If the value of labor power is attributed to labor as a factor of production, and that value is less than the total value of the commodity, then the remainder of the value must have some other source than labor. Quote, the other portions of value, profit and rent, also appear independent with respect to wages, and must arise from sources of their own, which are specifically different and independent of labor. They must arise from the participating elements of production, to the share of whose owners they fall. Profit arises from the participating elements of production. The material elements of capital, and rent arises from the land, or nature, as represented by the landlord, because at one pole the price of labor power assumes the transmuted form of wages, surplus value appears as the opposite pole in the transmuted form of profit. End quote. Capital, Volume 3. The capitalist receives a profit as a return on his capital, and consequently the capital itself appears to be the source of that profit. In the transformation of surplus value into profit, the illusion arises that it is the entire capital that gives rise to surplus value, and its specific origin in the extraction of surplus labor is concealed. Moreover, in the course of the production and realization of surplus value, capital takes on various forms, money capital, productive capital, commodity capital, and the functions that fall to each of these forms in the reproduction of capital may be taken on by specialized capitals, money lenders' capital, industrial capital, and commercial capital. Each of these capitals must be compensated by receiving a share of the surplus value, and this gives rise to the distinctive forms of surplus value. Interest, the quote, profit of enterprise, and commercial profit, each of which appears to have a distinctive source. Finally, barriers to the equalization of the rate of profit give rise to rent, which is not a product of the land, but a form of surplus value. The relationship between surplus value and the forms in which it appears as interest, commercial profit, the profit of enterprise, and rent is a complex and mediating relationship, in the development of which the nature and determinants of surplus value are systematically obscured. All the phenomena that appear in competition, quote, seem to contradict the determination of value by labor time, as much as the nature of surplus value consisting of unpaid surplus labor. Thus, everything appears reversed in competition. The final pattern of economic relations is seen on the surface, in their real existence, and consequently in the conceptions by which the bearers and agents of these relations seek to understand them, is very different from, and indeed quite the reverse of, their inner, but concealed essential pattern and the conception corresponding to it. End quote. Capital, Volume 3. For each individual capitalist, the given preconditions of capitalist production are wages, the cost of raw materials and means of production, and rent and interest payable. In setting the price at which he will sell his commodity, the capitalist adds to these costs of production, which make up the cost price of the commodity, his expected rate of profit, which corresponds more or less to the normal profit of enterprise. The quote, portions into which surplus value is split, being given as elements of the cost price for the individual capitalist, appear conversely, therefore, as creators of surplus value, creators of a portion of the price of commodities, just as wages create the other. End quote. The result is that, quote, profit seems to be determined only secondarily by direct exploitation of labor, insofar as the latter permits the capitalist to realize a profit deviating from the average profit at the regulating market prices, which apparently prevail independent of such exploitation. Normal average profits themselves seem immanent in capital and independent of exploitation. Abnormal exploitation, or even average exploitation under favorable exceptional conditions, seems to determine only the deviations from average profit, not this profit itself. End quote. Capital, Volume 1. Thus, the theory embodied in the Trinity formula corresponds exactly to the experience and the everyday conceptions of the individual capitalist. The appearance of capitalist social relations in the form of the Trinity formula is consistent with the reality of the class relation between labor and capital, because it really is the case that the value of labor power and surplus value appear in the forms of wages, profit, and rent, And these forms, therefore, really are the starting point of the economic activity of the individual members of capitalist society. Quote, "These ready-made relations and forms, which appear as preconditions in real production, because the capitalist mode of production moves within the forms which it has created itself and which are its results, confront it equally as ready-made preconditions in the process of reproduction. As such, they in fact determine the actions of individual capitalists, etc., and provide the motives which are reflected in their consciousness." End quote. Theories of surplus value. The capitalists are not aware that in producing commodities, in order to make a profit, they are also producing and reproducing capitalist social relations. To the individual, the appearances seem natural and rational. For the individual takes for granted the social relations within which things acquire their social powers. The need to reproduce capitalist social relations does not immediately enter into the consciousness of the individual capitalist. Yet in fulfilling his role in the capitalist production of commodities, this is nevertheless what the individual capitalist achieves. So long as political economy does not question the naturalness of capitalist social relations, political economy is unable to get beyond the illusions of the Trinity formula, and political economy can do no more than present in a more or less systematic fashion the irrational forms in which capitalist social relations appear. The critique of political economy depends on a critique of the apparently natural foundations of capitalist social relations, in order to establish that those social relations express a particular social form of production. This is what Marx achieved in his critique of the Trinity formula, as the fullest development of the fetishism of commodities. The Ricardian contradiction. I have argued that the foundation of Marx's critique of political economy is not the labor theory of value, in quotes, but the theory of alienated labor. The, quote, labor theory of value, unquote, is thus not the foundation, but the result of Marx's analysis of the social forms of value and of surplus value. It is only on the basis of this analysis that it is possible to pose the problem of the quantitative determination of value and of price. The key to the solution of this problem is provided by Marx's critique of the Trinity formula. The Trinity formula corresponds to the form in which social relations appear to the members of society, as relations in which things are exchanged by private individuals. It therefore expresses in the most developed form the alienated character of commodity production, within which social relations appear in the form of relations between things. It represents the culmination of the fetishism of commodities, and the basis on which bourgeois social theories achieve the naturalization. The Trinity formula therefore expresses in the most developed form the alienated character of commodity production production within which social relations appear in the form of relations between things. The Trinity formula represents the culmination of the fetishism of commodities and the basis on which bourgeois social theories achieve the naturalization of capitalist class relations. We have already seen that the physiocrats identified the natural fertility of the soil as the source of rent, and that Adam Smith at times seemed to be extending the physiocratic theory to capital. The generalization of the physiocratic theory of distribution, which became the subsequent basis of vulgar economy, was completed by Jean-Baptiste Say, for whom the revenues accruing to the different factors of production correspond to the productive contributions of each factor. The problem with this sort of theory, as we have seen in the case of Smith, is that it is not only irrational in attributing social powers to things, but it is also indeterminate. Since wages, rent, and profit are determined independently of one another, in accordance with the respective productive contributions of labor, land, and capital, the price of the commodity is simply the sum of wages, rent, and profit. However, wages, rent, and profit are themselves prices. So in the absence of a general equilibrium within which all prices and revenues are determined simultaneously, vulgar economy lacks any determinate theory of distribution. Smith and Say made important contributions in elucidating the relations between land, labor, and capital on the one hand, and rent, wages, and profit on the other, as they appeared on the surface of capitalist society. However, Smith and Say were unable to penetrate to the obscure structure of the bourgeois economic system. Beneath the bourgeois economic system's, quote, externally apparent forms of life, end quote, because Smith and Say had no theory of value that would enable them to explore the relations between the classes. The labor theory of value is the basis on which, quote, Ricardo exposes and describes the economic contradictions between the classes, as shown by the intrinsic relations, and that consequently political economy perceives, discovers the root of the historical struggle and development, end quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2. However, class relations disappear, quote, in the phenomena of competition, end quote. For in competition, members of classes relate to one another as individuals, and each class appears to have an independent source of revenue. Thus, Smith noted that quite different factors appear to regulate wages, profits, and rent, respectively. Moreover, price bears no apparent relation to labor time, being tautologically the sum of costs, which Smith reduced to wages, profit, and rent. Finally, in relation to individual commodities, there is no necessary relationship between wages and profits. An increase in wages being associated sometimes with a rise in profits. Thus, Smith abandoned the labor theory of value as soon as he moved beyond the, quote, early and rude state of society, end quote, to adopt a, quote, adding up theory of price that corresponded to the apparent relations expressed in the Trinity formula. Ricardo insisted on retaining the labor theory of value, despite the fact that the labor theory of value apparently contradicted the determination of prices in the individual relations of competition. Ricardo was well aware of the contradiction, but he could not afford to abandon the labor theory of value, because without the labor theory of value, Ricardo could not explore the relations between classes. Ricardo therefore sought to reconcile the theory of value with the determination of price. Ricardo did this through the misguided search for a formalistic solution to the problem that prices are affected by the distribution between wages and profits. This was Ricardo's search for a, quote, invariable measure of value, end quote. The defenders of Ricardo sought similar formalistic solutions to the contradictions to which the Ricardian theory of value gave rise. These contradictions, the later Ricardians, quote, attempted to solve with phrases in a scholastic way. Crass empiricism turns into false metaphysics, scholasticism, which toils painfully to deduce undeniable empirical phenomenon by simple formal abstraction, directly from the general line. I'm going to restart that whole thing. These contradictions, the later Ricardians, quote, attempt to solve with phrases in a scholastic way. Crass empiricism turns into false metaphysics, scholasticism, which toils painfully to deduce undeniable empirical phenomenon by simple formal abstraction, directly from the general law, or to show by cunning argument that they are in accordance with that law, end quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 1. The obvious alternative to such metaphysics was to return to the approach of Smith and Say, which derived the revenues of the different factors of production independently of one another. Such an approach had the merit of constructing a theory of distribution that accorded with the common sense experience of the members of capitalist society. The, quote, vulgarization of political economy could claim a certain descriptive validity, so that, quote, vulgar economy could present itself as an empirically grounded doctrine against the dogmatic abstractions of Ricardian political economy. Moreover, it had the added ideological appeal of a theory that determined distributive shares independently of one another, and so dissolved the conflicts that were inherent in the Ricardian theory. However, to abandon the labor theory of value was to abandon any attempt to penetrate the illusions of the fetishism of commodities in order to establish a determinate theory of class relations. Thus, for Marx, the vulgarization of political economy marked the abandonment of any scientific pretensions. Quote, where the classical and consequently the critical economists are exercised by the form of alienation and seek to eliminate the form of alienation by analysis, the vulgar economists, on the other hand, feel completely at home precisely with the alienated form in which the different parts of value confront one another. End quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3. It is clear that the contradiction between price and value is potentially fatal for the Ricardian system. But to abandon the labor theory of value would be to abandon any attempt to develop a determinate theory of class relations. The theories of vulgar economy are trivially consistent with the observed tendency for prices to be formed in accordance with the equalization of the rate of profit on capital, but are indeterminate. The Ricardian theory of value gives a determinate theory of distribution, but one which does not accord with observed tendencies. The contradiction can only be resolved by distinguishing clearly between the formation of surplus value on the basis of the expenditure of surplus labor and the formation of profit on the basis of the equalization of the profit rate, and by investigating more closely the relationship between the two, in order to show that the contradiction is, quote, an illusion which arises from the development of the thing itself, end quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2. This must involve a repudiation of the formal abstraction of Ricardo's attempt to derive prices immediately from values, in order to uncover the real movement in which surplus value labor takes the form of surplus value, and surplus value is transformed into profit. Ricardo cannot do this because Ricardo's method of formal abstraction leads him to ignore the specific features of the social form in which prices diverge from values and so from the specific determinants of price in a particular form of society. It is because he cannot see capitalism as a particular form of society that Ricardo identifies the exchange value of the commodity immediately with the concrete labor embodied in the commodity, and seeks to secure the immediate reconciliation of value and price. Thus, Ricardo wants to show that the various economic categories or relationships, thus Ricardo, quote, wants to show that the various economic categories or relationships do not contradict the theory of value, instead of, on the contrary, developing them together with their apparent contradictions out of this basis, or presenting the development of this basis itself. Hence, the contradiction between the general law and further developments in the concrete circumstances is to be resolved not by the discovery of the connecting links, but by directly subordinating and immediately adapting the concrete to the abstract, end quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2 and 3. The reconciliation of surplus value and profit can only be achieved by an analysis of the real social processes through which surplus value and profit, respectively, are formed. Prices are not relations between things, but are the expression of social relations of production. The price of any commodity, however, will express not one, but a number of social relations. The commodity is produced by a set of workers under the direction of a particular capital, in competition with other capitals, selling perhaps yet other capitals or perhaps to workers. The commodity, therefore, exists at the point of intersection of a series of social relationships between and within classes. Fluctuations in the price of individual commodities are the means by which a range of social relations are regulated. The framework within which prices regulate the social relations of production is that of the material and social reproduction of capitalist society. The price mechanism is the means by which the conditions for the expanded reproduction of capital, without which no material production would take place, are imposed on particular capitals as an external constraint. An analysis that ignores the social form of price and does not concern itself with social relations will abstract from the formation of price from this context, within which alone it has any social significance, to construct scholastic formulae or sets of simultaneous equations that will accurately predict the price of a commodity. The more complex are such formulae, the more accurately will they be able to achieve their predictive task, and the less they will illuminate. A more adequate theory will have to analyze the formation of prices. A more adequate theory will have to analyze the formation of prices within the framework of the expanded reproduction of capital and make this the basis of its abstractions. Within this framework, the most abstract level of analysis is that of the reproduction of the class relation between capital and labor. Since the relation between capital and labor is the fundamental social relation of capitalist society, whose reproduction is the condition for the reproduction of all other social relations. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx was concerned to explore this aspect of capitalist reproduction alone. The labor theory of value provides an appropriate and an adequate basis on which to investigate the relationship between capital and wage labor in the exchange of capital for labor power, and in the production of value and of surplus value. And so Marx's analysis was conducted on that basis. We have already seen that the theory of surplus value does not depend on the assumption that commodities exchange at prices corresponding to their labor values. The assumption of equivalent exchange in this sense is an assumption appropriate at this level of abstraction, not because, quote, production is in some ontological sense, quote, prior to exchange, but because, quote, the assumption of equivalent exchange adequately expresses the social relation under investigation, the class relation around which capitalist production as a whole revolves. I lost my spot. Where the hell am I? Jesus Christ, I really lost. I scrolled down a little bit and really. Okay, that's too far. Alright, I think I found my spot, but I'm gonna have to reread some shit. The theory of surplus value depends on the distinction between labor and labor power that defines the social form of the relation between labor and capital. And it is on this basis that the theory establishes that the source of surplus value is the unpaid labor of the wage worker. Whatever the prices at which commodities exchange, the source of surplus value remains the surplus labor of the wage worker. It is therefore appropriate to conceptualize the relation between capital and labor within which surplus value is produced on the basis of the labor theory of value, since this eliminates all extraneous considerations at this level of abstraction. Many commentators have recognized that the theory of surplus value does not depend on the assumption that commodities in practice exchange at prices corresponding to labor values, only to claim that it rests instead on the moral argument derived from a reading of Locke that labor is entitled to its full product. This claim is also fallacious. The entitlement of labor to its full product is not a moral argument propounded by Locke or any other philosopher. It is a description of the social and juridical reality of commodity-producing society. Such a society has eliminated the compulsory obligations laid on the slave and the serf to labor for another, and has established the unchallengeable right of the laborer to the full fruits of her labor. However, it has also given the laborer the unchallengeable right to assign her right to the product to another, and to enter into the wage contract by which she will labor for the benefit of another. The philosophers have not invented these rights. The philosophers have merely sought to reconcile the contradictions to which these rights give rise. The illusion of the wage form is the illusion that the worker receives the full fruits of her labor. By contrast, Marx's analysis of exchange as a moment of the reproduction of capitalist social relations establishes that surplus value is the value form of labor that is appropriated without equivalent. In the analysis of the transformation of surplus value into profit, and of profit into its fragmented forms of interest, commercial profit, the profit of enterprise and rent, we have to move beyond consideration of the class relation between capital and labor to consider the relations between capitalists. In looking at these relations, we are no longer concerned with the social relation within which surplus value is produced, but are now looking at relations within which existing surplus value is distributed amongst the individual capitalists. The analysis of these relations within the capitalist class proposes the analysis of the class relation between capital and labor. The analysis of these relations within the capitalist class presupposes the analysis of the class relation between capital and labor, both formally, in that capitalists can only exist on the basis of the existence of a class of wage laborers, and substantively, in that exchange can only redistribute commodities that have already been produced and appropriated within capitalist class relations. The mechanism by which shares in the total surplus value are allocated to individual capitals is that of the formation of prices through capitalist competition, and the theoretical problem at this level of abstraction is to specify the law of that competition. Within the system of petty commodity production, Marx assumed that the law of competition was that of the exchange of commodities at prices corresponding to their labor values. This law is determined by the requirements of the material and social reproduction of a society of petty commodity producers. On the basis of such exchanges, labor will tend to be allocated to various branches of production in accordance with the requirements of the material reproduction of that society. If too much labor is allocated in a given branch of production, the price of the commodity will fall below its value, and some producers will transfer their production to underpopulated branches. The social coordination of production is thus achieved through the equilibration of competitive markets at prices corresponding to labor values. However, the exchange of commodities at prices corresponding to their values is not an inexorable law. It is the social law of competition appropriate to a particular hypothetical type of society. Within a capitalist society, such a law of competition would be inappropriate, since it would not permit the material reproduction of society. If it were the case that individual capitals appropriated surplus value in accordance with their contribution to its production, in accordance with their contribution to surplus value's production, the result would be that only industrial capitals would earn a profit, while the rate of profit on different industrial capitals would be different, depending on the organic composition and the turnover time of the individual capital. Within a capitalist society, the law of motion of capital is the need for capital constantly to expand itself, a need that is enforced through competition between capitals in which the less successful are destroyed. Thus, if commodity is exchanged at their values, every capital would be applied in the most profitable branch of production, and nothing else would be produced. The law of capitalist competition is not, therefore, the tendency for commodities to exchange at prices corresponding to their values, but is the tendency for commodities to exchange at prices corresponding to the equalization of the rate of profit. The material reproduction of capitalist society requires that commodities exchange at prices that, in general, diverge from values in a way as to equalize the rate of profit on different employments of capital. This does not mean that the material reproduction of capitalist society is guaranteed by the regulatory role of competition. The driving force of capitalist accumulation is the uneven development of the forces of production, which underlies the tendency to overproduction of commodities, and the uneven development of the forces of production, as each capitalist seeks to steal a competitive advantage. The tendency to the equalization of the rate of profit only acts as a counter-tendency to the underlying tendency to uneven development, which does not act smoothly, but only through commercial crises and revolutions in value. Quote, revolutions in value. It is quite possible that the transformation of values into prices in the course of capitalist competition might have an effect on the quantitative determination of the rate of surplus value through its effect on the value of labor power. However, any such quantitative modification of the determination of the rate of surplus value has no implications for the analysis of the social form of the production and appropriation of surplus value, nor for the conclusion of that analysis that the basis of surplus value is the social relation of capitalist production and its source is the unpaid labor of the working class. Thus, the distributional impact of the transformation of values into prices is an aspect of the redistribution of value. Thus, the distributional impact of the transformation of values into prices is an aspect of the redistribution of value that can only be adequately conceptualized on the basis of a prior theory of value and surplus value, and is not an aspect of its production and appropriation. Classical political economy cannot resolve the Ricardian contradiction between value and price because classical political economy failed to distinguish the social processes of the production and appropriation of surplus value on the one hand, and the redistribution of surplus value on the other. Marx's critique of political economy, in explaining the social form of capitalist production and reproduction, was able finally to resolve this contradiction by establishing that value and price are concepts that are both valid, but that are appropriate to the investigation of different social processes, which have to be analyzed at different levels of abstraction. Thus, Marx was finally able to reconcile a theory of the class relationship of capitalist society with the determination of revenues in exchange. Formal and determinate abstraction. Marx's analysis of the social formation of value and surplus value, of prices and of revenues, on the basis of his progressively more concrete analysis of the social relations of capitalist production, it enabled Marx to establish the concrete social forms through which the fundamental tendencies of capitalist reproduction, which he had already identified in his early works, were expressed in and mediated by the most superficial and fragmented forms of capitalist social relations. Although Marx's analysis was no less abstract than that of political economy, the form of his abstraction was quite different. Political economy abstracted its concepts immediately from the fetishized forms of appearance of capitalist society, and specifically from the relations of commodity exchange, in which prices and revenues appear to derive from the inherent qualities of things. In Ricardo's case as the products of useful labor, in the case of Say as the products of the three factors of production, in the case of vulgar economy as the objects of subjective valuations of utility. However, this method of formal abstraction is incoherent and irrational. The quote, formal abstractions of political economy are not gratuitous inventions, but express real abstractions in a mystified form. Thus, the quote, abstract individual really exists in a capitalist society. However, the individual is a, quote, formal abstraction when it is considered an abstraction from the individual's historical foundations, which lies in the separation of the laborer from the means of production, in abstracting its fundamental concepts from the social forms of capitalist production and reproduction. Political economy abstracts from the social relations, which alone determine the qualities which it calls on to give its concepts their explanatory powers. The private individual, private property, the value-creating power of labor, the, quote, productivity of capital, the formation of rent, the, quote, tastes of the consumer, have no determinate existence outside the social relations of capitalist production, and so the causal relations proposed by political economy equally have no determinate existence. Political economy could at best describe, but it could not explain. Marx's abstraction, by contrast, is a method of, quote, determinate abstraction, in which Marx's abstractions correspond not to, quote, essential qualities embodied in things, but to determinate social processes. The distinction between the abstract and the concrete for Marx therefore corresponds not to the distinction between the, quote, essential and the, quote, inessential, but to the distinction between the general and the particular. The theory of value, for example, expresses the generality of the social relations through which social labor is expressed in the form of the value of the commodity, and the generality of the social processes through which the allocation of social labor is regulated through the exchange of commodities. The abstraction value corresponds to and is only appropriate to a society in which such processes have become generalized. Quote, indifference towards any specific kind of labor presupposes a very developed totality of real kinds of labor, of which no single kind of labor is any longer predominant. As a rule, the most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to many, to all. Then it ceases to be thinkable in a particular form alone. On the other side, this abstraction of labor as such is not merely the mental product of a concrete totality of labors. Indifference towards specific labors corresponds to a form of society in which individuals can with ease transfer from one labor to another, and where the specific kind is a matter of chance for them, hence of indifference. End quote. Grundrisse. The law of value is only valid to the extent that the features of the social processes depicted by the law pertain to every particular example of those processes. At the same time, every particular example will add other determinations, which have to be conceptualized at progressively lower levels of abstraction, so that the, quote, concrete is the concentration of many determinations. Thus, the theoretical analysis of the social forms of capitalist production developed in capital does not provide any kind of eternal truth, but only the analytical foundations on which to develop comparative and historical analyses of the more concrete and complex particular forms in which capitalist social relations are expressed and developed. Similarly, the concrete investigation of any of the, quote, laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production will show how, quote, like all other laws, it is modified in its working by many circumstances, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. The economist's model of capitalism was an abstract model which described an ideal world of perfect rationality, perfect knowledge, and perfect foresight, which express the perfectibility of man within the limits of nature. Even the most optimistic of the political economists had to acknowledge that their world of harmony and prosperity hardly corresponded to the reality of capitalist society. However, the other side of political economy's method of, quote, formal abstraction was political economy's attempt to derive reality immediately from its fundamental concepts. The ideal model grasped the essence of reality. The ideal model depicted the possibilities of material and spiritual emancipation which economic and political liberalism offered to humanity. The perfection of the abstract model showed that the source of the acknowledged evils of capitalism could not be private property, wage labor, or unrestrained competition. If reality did not correspond to this ideal, it was not the ideal which was at fault, but human intellectual and moral weaknesses which prevented humanity from living up to the abstract ideal. Thus, the divergences of reality from the ideal model were explained in terms of human frailty and human imperfection. The appropriate methods of social reform were correspondingly identified as the moral and intellectual elevation of the species. Thus, the method of formal abstraction, which was the source of the scientific weakness of political economy, was also the source of its ideological strength. For Marx, by contrast, the evils of capitalism were inseparable from its progressive characteristics. While capitalism undoubtedly developed the forces of material and intellectual production to an unprecedented degree, capitalism developed those forces within social relations in which the production and appropriation of the social product was subordinated not to human need, but to the accumulation of capital. The alienated form of social labor under capitalism was not a technical necessity imposed by the development of the division of labor, but a specific historically developed form of social production, based on specific social relations of exploitation and domination. These relations of exploitation and domination were not simply the result of the contingent abuse of capitalist power, but were the necessary form of the social relations of capitalist production, imposed on every capitalist by the pressure of competition, through which every capitalist was compelled to subordinate all human considerations to the production of surplus value. Far from expressing the possibilities of human intellectual and material freedom, the social relations of capitalist production increasingly subject humanity to domination by an alien power, the power of capital. The development of human productive and intellectual capacities serves only to increase the power which stands over humanity. At the same time, however, the socialization of production leads to the development of new social collectivities in the form of working class organizations, which contest the power of capital and which provide the foundation on which a new form of society can be built.